Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flip classroom and our last discussion about World War II, right? So I recorded this flip last year that I'm about to clip in right now. It's a really, really good one. These last few flips that I actually made last year are some of the best that I've made in a long time, and I feel like they convey the message of the content really, really well, right? So the big thing about it is, though, is like when you come back in tomorrow, we're going to start like reviewing all of our content, all the time periods and stuff like that. We're going to save about 25 minutes at the end of class for doing some like practice multiple choice questions and stuff like that, just to take a look at our speed, where we're going to be at, how we feel, and all of the stuff, all the multiple choice questions I'll be doing tomorrow and practicing will actually mostly pertain to the entirety of the content. So I hope all of you are having a great time studying. I hope all of you are doing well. And remember, your DBQ is due tomorrow as well. So if y'all need anything else, let me know, all right? I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one. At the Nazis and also at the Italians, right? They are ready to fight tooth and nail to stay in this thing. And so it's important that you know that as winter approaches, the Russians get even more furious, right? Because they're like, you are now on our turf and you are attacking our key cities and you are hurting our people. So they are waiting and biding their time, right? But then also another big thing happens about a year later after the start of Operation Barbarossa, give or take like several months after it, the U.S. is going to enter the war because of the attack on Pearl Harbor, right? So the attack on Pearl Harbor is going to be the thing that sends the United States into the war in December 7th, 1941. Now, this is the entire time where the U.S. and the Allies were just hoping and hoping and hoping that the Russians would be able to at least hold the Nazis off, which they did, right? The Russians literally just like refused to relent and refused to surrender, okay? Now, at the actual beginning of Operation Barbarossa, a lot of people were like, where's Stalin? Because apparently like he was ill and stuff like that. But then eventually he came out with these like large-scale propaganda films and stuff like that to keep the Russians from surrendering. But here come the U.S. after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. Now, the question is why did they do this? Why did they attack Pearl Harbor? Well, a lot of it has to do with the fact that the United States had cut off oil and copper reserves going to this area, right? So oil and copper was not heading to Japan anymore because the United States had cut that resource off to them. And then also on top of everything else, the Japanese were planning a large-scale invasion of most of the Southeast Pacific, right? So most of like parts of Indonesia, an area called Guadalcanal and places like that, the Japanese were planning on increasing their sphere of influence and taking over a huge number of islands and also eastern China during this campaign. And so they didn't want the Americans to come in and stop that, and they knew that they had the ability to come in and stop that because the fact of the matter is that the entire Pacific Fleet of the United States of America was stationed at Pearl Harbor when the Japanese attacked. So one, the Japanese were resentful because of the cutoff of resources, and two, the Japanese also planned on expanding their influence into Southeast Pacific, and they wanted to stop the U.S. from having the ability to enter into the war. So what this is going to happen, this right here is, as I was getting at, that right there is all the orange is the occupied zone of Japan, right? So the biggest thing about it, though, is, and the Pearl Harbor is right there. So Japan knew if they were increasing their influence that they needed to actually stop the Americans from ever getting involved, right? So now the biggest thing about it, though, is looking at this whole thing, America's now on its way. The United States is mobilizing its military and preparing for war, right? But this is still the situation in Europe, okay? So going into it, a lot of people think, well, you would attack the Pacific first, right? You would attack Japan first due to the fact that they attacked you, so of course you would attack them first. It's not actually the case. They go after Europe first for a really big particular reason. Look at this map. No one was going to stop this advance of the Nazi Germans as well as the Axis powers. No one was going to stop them if someone did not enter in to tip the scales, right? And the Americans are going to be that power that enters in to tip the scales. The British wanted the Americans to come in to help them push the German lines back and to push like the Axis power lines back. But the thing that had to happen is Russia just had to hold on at Leningrad, Moscow, and then also in Stalingrad. Where'd you go? All right, so Stalingrad, I think, is like right over here. All right, now, like, so the biggest thing about it, though, in the long run is they do go Europe first. The meeting of the heads of state happened where they decide how they were going to attack Europe and that they were going to focus on Europe first and then focus all their attention on the Pacific. Now, in this Europe first strategy, Winston Churchill, in his meetings with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was the president at the time of the United States, FDR, right? So as he's commonly known. Winston Churchill and FDR got together and discussed how they were going to pull this off. And they had French representatives at this meeting as well, because most of the French military was in exile in England because of the evacuation of Dunkirk, right? Remember that in the back of your mind. Most of the French military was in exile in England after the evacuation of Dunkirk, right? So the biggest thing about it, though, in the long run, is they all got together and met with one another, and they decided on their approach, right? Now, Woodrow Wilson, FDR was really adamant about directly attacking Europe, and he was like, this would be the best thing for us to do. But Woodrow Wilson said that he did not want to do that, right? So they went with Woodrow's idea first because they wanted to liberate Europe and then turn towards Japan. The European theater is what it's called, and then there's the Pacific theater. So there were two theaters of this war. So Winston Churchill's idea was, let's do this instead of attacking Europe directly and costing the lives of a lot of British soldiers and possibly civilians, right? Step one, invade North Africa, right? This thing was known as Operation Torch. It was a joint operation with the Allies to push the Axis back into Italy, right? So the idea here was that they were going to attack installations that the Nazis, Germans, and then also the Italians had actually set up in Morocco and Algeria, right? So this area would have actually been taken over and conquered by the Axis powers. The plan was that the Allies were going to land on these different areas and push them all the way backwards and then up into Italy. Because, for those of you who don't know, your maps and stuff, Italy is right here, right? It's, located right here above North Africa. So the plan was actually to, push them in and then all the way back and then up into Italy and then go up Italy and then right there, if you can actually pull that off, if you can go up Italy, you'll be right below Germany. You can attack Germany directly, right? Now, it's all fine and good. This is a very decent idea, mainly due to the fact that the Nazis are not going to be able, the Nazis and the Italian fascists are not going to be able to hold on to North Africa due to the fact that they're very, very spread out. It's a very geographically large area. And then also it's all contingent on Erwin Rommel, the Nazi general, being able to hold on to this territory using fast movement strikes. Remember, the Nazis used blitzkrieg techniques. They were not as much on occupational forces of these different areas. So when the Allies landed, they were very successful in actually pushing the fascist powers all the way back through North Africa, right? So now going into it, though, once that happens, meanwhile, the Soviets are going to hold the Germans off at Stalingrad and Leningrad. And they did this for almost 4 years. Going on 4 years, the Russians were able to endure massive fascist attack and massive Axis attack on their two main cities, or their two key targets, right? So Leningrad and Moscow were the big ones that had to hold on, right? So if you look at the years, if you ever want to take 2 seconds and just kind of take a look at it and stuff like that, the siege of Leningrad actually lasted from September 8th, 1941, all the way up to January 27th, 1944. So nearly 3 to 4 years, they were able to withstand the entire attack of the Nazi party. Now, so also you have the siege of Moscow, right? And the siege of Moscow was able to hold on for over a year as well, from September 30th to April 20th, 1942. Well, it's several months, right? And the method by the Germans and the Italians was to constantly bombard and blockade these cities off and lead these people to starvation and eventual surrender. But Stalin came out with a massive campaign of propaganda films and ads and things like that, telling the Russians, do whatever you can to stay in this fight. Do not give up. We are Russian and we do not surrender. And they turned to, there were cases of Soviet citizens making soup out of rats and wallpaper to try and stay alive. And the Russians are going to be able to hold on, even when the fascist organizations and the Axis powers decide to take the two armies from Leningrad and Stalingrad, from Leningrad and Moscow that they never were able to take over, sweep them down into southern Russia and attack Stalingrad, and they still couldn't take that either. Just don't attack Russia in winter. Just don't do it. You're dumb. And this, you can see the cities of Leningrad, Moscow, and Stalingrad were absolutely devastated. Completely attacked by artillery barrages and completely destroyed. This right here, for example, is a children's playground, right? So now, that's a sculpture of a children's playground, by the way. It's not actual children standing there. So they were able to hold on, right? So step 2 in this whole process, after you invade North Africa, and then you have the Soviets withhold the actual German attack, now you're going to move up through Italy. Also known as the Italian campaign, and the Americans called it Operation Husky is what we called it. Now, the big thing that you need to understand when it comes to the Italian campaign, though, wasn't the best decision. Not Woodrow Wilson. Jeez, Abigail Whittingham is literally going to have my head. Now, look, Winston Churchill had a great idea, right? The idea to push up through Italy seems like it would make a lot of sense. But the thing about it is, things they didn't compensate for nor think about, is that Italy has very, 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 very large, it's a thin, first of all, it's only about 100 miles wide, right? It's a very, very narrow strip of land, and you have to push northward through this narrow strip of land. And it also has towns and cities all over it that the Italians and the Nazis were dug into, right? And it was very difficult for the Americans and the combined British forces to oust them out of Italy because they were so dug into these numerous cities. And as you get further and further up Italy, it gets more and more mountainous and hill-like terrain, right? It's much more intense and hard to get over. And once, let's say hypothetically, the Americans got all the way to North Italy, then you got to cross the Alps to get into Germany, right? So all things considered, the Italian campaign kind of stalled out a little bit, and it wasn't a very, very good idea. It was very costly, so the Americans and the British had to pivot. And what they decide to do is step 3, right? They're going to do a pincer move, and they're going to open up a new front of this war. Come at them from 2 sides. Now, if you include the Soviets, it'll be 3 sides, right? So now, the idea of step 3 was our Italian campaign is getting stalled out, right? If you look at this map right here, that's about right there is about where the Allies actually got to, over Rome and places like that, into that area right there. And all this area is Alps, and it's Milan that's occupied by the Germans by this point. What the Allies want to do is they want to open up a new front, right? Because as you can see, the Russians are holding the Nazis off right here. They want to open up this front. They want to directly invade and liberate France, right? And in June 6, 1944, they came up with the operation known as D-Day, all right? So, D-Day was the day designated for when it would happen. The operation was known as Operation Overlord, right? And they decided that they wanted to invade France, go over the English Channel, which is a very small strait of water, get into France, and begin to push the Nazis and the Italians back into Germany that way, in that direction, to basically overwhelm the Axis front lines and start pushing them all back into Germany. The idea was this: race. We're going to race with the Russians to see who can get to Berlin first, right? So now look, on June 6, 1944, the Allies mounted a massive joint assault on Normandy and opened a gaping hole in the Nazi defenses. They had 3 waves of soldiers doing an extremely dangerous operation, right? The plan was to leave from all these different locations in England and then land on the beaches of France. Now, why do I have all these question marks right here? Why are they there? They were able to do this because the Nazis considered themselves at the time very, very good in the ideas of code breaking, right? So code breaking and actually picking up transmissions and knowing the movements of the British soldiers. So what we did, the Americans and the British began to send massive amounts of information, allowing the Nazis to actually intercept it willingly, and then confusing the ever-loving daylights out of them. The Germans thought we might land here, thought we might land there, thought we might land there, thought we might land there, because we were literally sending these messages out, expecting for them to get intercepted. And where we decided to go were these series of beaches right here. There were 5 of them, right? 5 of them. It was, let me see, Utah, Omaha. Yeah, the beaches were called Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, Sword, right? And we took Utah, Omaha, and Gold with the British, right? We had planned to land and use amphibious aircraft to allow the fronts to drop and then just invade the beaches. Now, the thing about it is this was extremely dangerous, right? Extremely dangerous, due to the fact that the fortifications on the hills above the beaches were very intense, and the Germans had been there for quite some time. But we came, as you can see, with so much artillery that there was no way that you could stop us, right? So, they let down the front gates, the soldiers ran onto the beaches, and the Nazis were also being attacked from behind because we dropped paratroopers behind the Nazi lines into France, right? Overwhelming their defenses and taking those beaches and opening up a hole in this area. Now, here's the entire crazy thing as well. This is a very important moment because now even some of the Nazi leadership is beginning to freak out, and they're believing that they have no way to win this war anymore. They are starting to believe that they have no shot at winning this war. Some of the generals are trying to encourage Hitler to do certain things to fortify their defenses, encourage peace talks, but Hitler refuses to have them. And in July of 1944, several of his top generals tried to assassinate him. Jot this down real quick. It's not on the slide. It was called the Valkyrie plot, or the July 20th plot, right? Valkyrie on July 20th, 1944. A bunch of Nazi upper generals officers tried to assassinate Hitler and tried to blow him up in one of his bunkers, right? So he was in this place called the Wolf's Den. It was in the forest of Germany, and it was a bunker where he could have a safe house, and Hitler would have meetings with his top brass and stuff like that. And this guy named Klaus von Stauffenberg actually planted a bomb, and they tried to blow him up and kill him. But they didn't kill Hitler. They only injured his leg. And this led Hitler to be extremely paranoid and increasingly really off his rocker, and begins to actually have this campaign of executing the people that tried to kill his families, and then also trying to have a purge of his own of the Nazi party. So it's leading to him to be very, very erratic, right? And so when this is all going down, and he's being assassination attempts on his life by his own officers, the Allies are also pushing into France, right? And so right after July 20th, less than a month after he almost dies from a bomb, the Allies push into France and they liberate the city of Paris. And the people of Paris rejoiced in the streets at the arrival of British, American, and French troops. This right here are people marching down the Arc de Triomphe with American flags, British flags, and French flags, uniting in their mission and saying that we will do this and beat back the fascist powers of the Axis alliance, right? And so here's where it's all coming in now. You've got the Allies pushing up this way. You've got the French and combined French, American, and British forces pushing in towards the west. And the Russians have held back the Nazi invasion of Stalingrad, Leningrad, and Moscow, and they're beginning to push back as well. This is shrinking like it's going out of style. Now, keep in mind, there was a really intense battle that was kind of the last draw, the last stand of the Germans and the Italians, was at this place called the Battle of the Bulge, right? So from December to January 1945. I don't know if you know this or not, but winters can get pretty intense in Europe, right? Now, as the Allies pushed the Germans back, there was a massive standoff in the Ardennes forest in the middle of the winter, and it was an extremely grueling battle. It was known as the Battle of the Bulge due to the fact that the conditions were so terrible that the American and British forces had no idea where they were, right? Look at these images, these photos and stuff like that. The Battle of the Bulge was fought in snow and in pine forests and stuff like that, and it was so bad that they basically got stalled out by the Nazi powers. And it's called the Battle of the Bulge because every time the lines would advance, they would bulge out. And this is a very key moment because they're getting close to the border of Germany, right? If you can win this battle at the Battle of the Bulge, you can win this war, right? It's the last major standoff, and it lasted for over a month and a half and cost a huge number of American lives. And because the Nazis were dug into these areas and were just artillery shelling the entire forest for long periods of time. The environment was so bad that literally this company that I was telling you about that liberated Birkenau, they got stuck and were surrounded by the Nazis right here, but they had no idea about it because the weather was so bad, right? Outside the town called Bastogne, right? So as you can see, the Battle of the Bulge was a very, very intense battle that's going to be the tipping point, but the Allies do eventually win it, right? They eventually win. They push the Nazis back. They take key cities like Bastogne and begin to keep pushing and pushing and pushing them back. And this happened in January of 1945. But then, cowards will always take a coward's way out, right? By the spring of 1945, as the snows begin to melt, as the Allies begin discovering these Nazi death camps, as they begin to discover the camps created during the Holocaust, as they begin to realize that this moment is getting more and more terrible by the second. By the spring of 1945, the leaders of these Axis powers are realizing that they have no chance to win this war, right? Russia is pushing into Berlin. They're right on the edge of Berlin. They're so close to taking over this entire area, to actually leading to the death of this figure and stuff like that. And then also the Italians. The Italians are turning. The Italians literally turn on Benito Mussolini, capture him, shoot him, and kill him and his wife, right? And they literally hang their dead bodies up from a gas station, right? That is Mussolini right there. That is Mussolini himself, his dead body hung upside down on a gas station. And every Italian person was like, it was your fault that this all happened. And they were grabbing sticks and hitting him like he's a piñata, right? As you can see, Benito Mussolini is now dead. So Italy is out of this war. And literally, Hitler runs into a bunker and freaks out and takes the coward's way out. And what he does, he goes down there with his new wife. He married her the day before this all happened. And her name was Ava Braun, and she was one of his actresses and helped him produce some of his propaganda films and stuff like that. So the biggest thing is, though, he gets married, he runs down there, and they decide to have a honeymoon in a bunker. And the bunker is at they go down there, and keep in mind, sorry, I'm getting excited. This is one of my favorite parts of the flip. All right, so look, Benito Mussolini dies in April of 1945, right? So April 25th, 1945, I believe is the day it happened. Benito Mussolini is shot and killed by his own people. Piñata, super gross, right? So now look, 5 days later when this happens, Hitler decides to get married and go down into this bunker. And what he does when he gets down there, he not only gives her poison and kills her, he gives his dogs poison and kills them, and then he shoots himself and commits suicide, right? Shoots himself. The Nazis discover his dead body. They take him out, and they burn his body in a ditch. And the only piece of Hitler's body that we had left, the only piece of his body that we have left is a fragment of his jaw, right? So a fragment of his jaw was literally the only pieces and bits of his entire body that we had that we could do any kind of tests on. And you can actually see all of his gold fillings and stuff like that and his teeth and things like that. And we have preserved it, but remnants of his jaw were taken, and we actually, it's the only piece of his, actual dead corpse that you could really, really identify. They had, a couple fragments of his skull and stuff like that from whenever this actually happened. But Hitler's jaw recently, as of, the early thousands, and the French dentists did DNA tests on it, and they were like, yeah, that's Hitler's, all right. But this led to a big conspiracy theory of, did he actually escape? And blah, 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 blah. Did he go to, Austria? Or not Austria, but did he go to Argentina? Now, looking at this right here, that is the bunker where he committed suicide with his wife and his dogs. Why the dogs, man? So now, look, Hitler kills himself, and the war is all but over, right? And that happened April 30th, 1945, 5 days after Mussolini kills himself, right? So, now notice, though, April 30th, May 8th, going on for about a week, but once this moment happens, they begin to sweep through Germany to denazify Germany, to get all these remaining, officers and things like that who might not be committed to this war being over yet. But as of May 8th, 1945, we are claiming VE Day, or Victory in Europe Day, right? So now the big thing about it, though, is we are going to there, and then we're going to pick up in class on the Pacific Theater, and we're going to discuss how the war finally came to an end when the Americans get involved and the Allies push into the Pacific and force Japan's surrender as well. But that's a pretty quick one, and we only have 3 slides left, so we'll talk about that stuff soon, but I'll see y'all then. Y'all have a good one.